Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 5 of series 12. The question for today is, to what extent has the concept of value been neglected and misunderstood? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 2. My interest in the concept and the phenomenon of value stems from its significance in a philosophy of life, as well as that all the activities of religion, romance, meaning, purpose, ethics, morality, and aesthetics can be explained as primary expressions of value. But the contention here is that value has been neglected and misunderstood. This suggests that something else is also likely to have been neglected and misunderstood that will have considerable impact on our understanding of human life, and that impact will be in the sphere of ethics and morality, but even more importantly to meaning, purpose, and accounts of human existence. But the concept of value is widely used as an undefined placeholder of just superficial applications of value. These are applications of value like ethical, economic, aesthetic, family, religious, and scientific values. Other terms like motivational, volitional, experiential, affective, utility, and perspectival values are both more analytical and descriptive. Yet, analyses of the inherent character or structure of value are surprisingly scarce. But widespread theories and debates about value might indicate that it has not been neglected and misunderstood. The idea of value is widely discussed, and ethical principles are seen as values that guide moral action. Questions like objective and subjective and intrinsic and attributed value have also been much debated, but many studies and references to the word value need not imply that it is understood. For example, as in other frequent references to the weather, E equals mc squared, or consciousness. Yet many philosophical works on the nature of value have also been published, like those of Findlay, Irwin, Fogarty, Swinburne, Shaw, Hall, Hobbes, Frondizi, Nozick, Mandelbaum, and Monticelli. But their studies are not widely read in the philosophical world. Max Stirner, Nietzsche, and Max Scheler are 19th and 20th century thinkers with respectively opposing subjective and objective accounts of value. Nietzsche admits his limitation in saying that the future task of philosophers is to determine the rank and order among values. Stirner can only provide an unrestrained subjectivity, and Scheler holds on to a hierarchy of value that is unable to adapt to variable circumstances. And this isn't a large number of what are hard to find studies of the explicit question, what is value? And some of them, like Findlay, Rizzeri, Frondizi, and E.W. Hall, are largely the studies of ethical theories, or are discussing tools for a methodological analysis of value rather than explicating value. Yet Mandelbaum and D.J. Hobbes do offer a more phenomenological approach to value, and Frondizi defines value as a Gestalt quality. However, a recent summary of David Hobbes' Phenomenology of Value by Routledge Books states that although values are a major component of our experiential lives, from aesthetics to ethics and beyond, much of the way in which they operate remains seemingly inexplicable, unquote. But I want to start this study with the neglect of value in early religious and Greek thought. For example, Cruden's 800-page concordance of the Judeo-Christian scripture records only 10 instances of the word value, and then only as a verb or adjective describing worth, yet not yet conceived as a noun or a state. The neglect of value in early human thought shows that value isn't immediately apparent as an idea, word, or a concept, or as a theory of value, but needs to be explicated as we're doing now, which isn't the case in the more obvious states of thinking, feeling, and willing. The above is the beginning of a development of the idea of value that we will track and define in its stages up to the present. But this development of the idea of value is a much overlooked fact due to the assumption that we have always had an explicit concept of value. But animals and humans had the experience of value even before there was a word for value, and the word value is different to the more elaborate concept of value. And the concept of value led to theories of value and then to viable theories of value. This is a process that has been overlooked, but which we will examine. As noted, the development of the idea of value begins with its absence in religious thought, and we can now observe its progression starting with ancient Greek thought outlined below. We will then follow the history of the idea of value up to and including modern times. In modern thought, we find that common applications and classifications of value are superficial and misleading. Much of this neglect can be explained with the background in scientific positivism and logical positivism. Then we'll come to the many idiosyncratic views in modern theory of value that underline the neglect and misunderstanding of value. Yet we can continue an early history of value with an account of ancient Greek and Aristotelian ethics. The neglect of value in the ancient religious world might be thought rectified in ancient Greek thought. But despite the advances of Aristotle's virtue theory, it lacked many aspects of the concept of value. For example, although Marx adopted Aristotle's distinction between use value and exchange value, Marx criticized Aristotle's failure to perceive value in terms of human labor. Aristotelian virtue is a matter of character and inclination that also omit crucial Kantian moral features. These omissions included moral intention and goodwill, as well as the value of people as ends in themselves. It was also blind to the fact-value problem and thereby accepted naturalistic ideals too uncritically. And Aristotle fallaciously attributed the value property of purpose to the definition of objects. In a further criticism of Aristotle, Elizabeth Anscombe tells us in her work Modern Moral Philosophy that the term moral just doesn't seem to fit in its modern sense into an account of Aristotelian ethics, because Anscombe tells us it lacks the concept of a moral sense of ought. Yet Aristotle invented the word ethics or ethikos, significantly meaning pertaining to character. And 3 centuries later, Cicero invented the word moral or moralis to translate the Greek word ethikos. These were great developments that nevertheless reveal their absence in previous ethics and value theory. As is often the case in philosophy, we'll now jump over a millennia to Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas retains Aristotle's objective intrinsic values and definitions of things with objective purpose, but he combines this with subjective utility, determined by human need and tempered by justice. Yet this was a subjectivity of human relations that still didn't make value explicit. Moving on to 1776, Etienne Bonnot was the first economist not to agree with either objective or utility value theory. He considered that both value and utility have a psychological substrate and result from individual interest. He wrote that value is not an attribute of matter, but represents our sense of its usefulness. Bonnot's subjective theory of value contrasts with Adam Smith's and Karl Marx's objectivist labour theory of value, that the value of a commodity is determined by the total amount of labour required to produce it. It may be significant that these developments came about largely in economics, even in Aquinas' thinking. Yet Hume's groundbreaking discovery of the is-ought distinction, as the development of the fact-value distinction, also came about in the 18th century. So these developments came late, revealing prior inadequacies still often overlooked today. More recently, Alistair MacIntyre tells us that the language and practice of morals is in grave disorder and disarray. And he goes so far as to find the premises of different theories of ethics incommensurate. I've myself argued that, unexpectedly, we currently don't have a viable theory of ethics. And as ethical principles are values, this indicates a neglect of values and ethical values. I've attempted to redress this neglect by proposing a value theory ethics. Summing this up and bringing us up to the early 20th century, Charles Gray Shaw wrote, "Value as a principle of ethics has been overlooked by both ancient and modern philosophy." This neglect of value is more obvious in the 19th century science and social science that were regarded as objective and value-free by Max Weber and the earlier Auguste Comte. Comte advocated a positivist and value-free sociology as a form of social physics. This was followed by Rudolf Carnap and the logical positivism of the Vienna Circle and A.J. Ayer. On this view, value judgments are senseless because they lack cognitive content. But the idea of value-free knowledge or science has been replaced by the view of them as value-laden by such as Tristram, Engelhardt, Heather Douglas, and Hilary Putnam's case for fact-value entanglement, where he goes further to argue that there's an evasion of values in the philosophy of science. Putnam's case that the philosophy of science evades values centres on his contention that knowledge of facts presupposes knowledge of values, that in science are epistemic values such as coherence, plausibility, reasonableness, simplicity, and elegance, and that the meaning of these values is subject to convention and cultural relativity. Putnam also raises the question of selection of theories, which reminds us of the preference of some philosophers like David Deutsch for deductive over inductive accounts. But it's highly questionable that purely deductive science without empirical judgments is possible. Hume's fork between necessary a priori relations of ideas and contingent a posteriori matters of fact that are known through experience and value judgment also argues against such deductive science. But demonstrating neglect of values incurs the problem of proving a negative or showing the absence of something. Yet this problem can be alleviated by examining the main schools of philosophy to see the neglect of value in each of them. These include analytic philosophy, linguistic philosophy, postmodernism, and phenomenology. This strategy enables us to make comprehensive judgments about philosophy in general. We've outlined above the neglect of value in science, positivism, and logical positivism. We can look at analytic philosophy that derives much of its subject matter and methods from science. And science is characterized by features like prediction, evidence, precision, quantification, and certainty. But positivist science is seen to neglect value, and one way this is done is by trying to remove the conscious observer from the picture. Analytic philosophy also implies the cognitive, non-cognitive classification of mental states. But this is a cognitively biased classification that defines non-cognitive states negatively and omits values. This is a cognitivist and epistemological bias to pursue knowledge that is widely recognized in analytic philosophy, as well as in its theories of ethics, morals, meaning, motivation, and action, illustrated by Barry Maguire's need to underline this neglect of value in advocating the promising but surprisingly overlooked value-based theory of reasons, unquote. Further to the binary analytic classification of cognitive and non-cognitive mental states, we can compare it to Kant's three faculties of Erkennen, Empfinden, and Wollen, or cognition, feeling, and will. So Kant's appreciation of value can only include it within feeling, not as a state in its own right. And he sometimes thought to regard feeling as almost pathological, or at least undesirable. This aversion to feeling might be explained because the word affect was only first used in its current meaning by Spinoza in 1675. A similar explanation is possible of the object model of values put forth by Max Scheler and Nikolai Hartmann that neglects the affect content of values by envisioning values as sort of an ideal object. Another aspect of analytic philosophy that reveals neglect is A.J. Ayer's logical positivism in his verification principle. That is, a proposition is only meaningful if it is subject to verification as either true or false. And his emotivist theory of ethics dismissed values as just emotions like laughing or crying. On this view, religious, ethical, poetic, intuitive, mythological, and value judgments are disregarded as meaningless. Ayer himself and others later rejected this view as excessive, but it nevertheless influenced philosophy. It does this because analytic philosophy continues to emphasize precision, verification, and language. Wittgenstein is the most prominent and influential philosopher who can well represent linguistic philosophy. He saw language as a form of life, of complex interrelations of life, and rejected the idea of a private language. But he is relevant here in insisting that we cannot talk about values or ethics. He writes, "It is clear that ethics cannot be put into words. Ethics is transcendental," because he says the sense or value of the world must lie outside the world. But Wittgenstein's view that we can't talk about ethics or values misunderstands ethics and values in several ways. Firstly, it presupposes that ethics and values are transcendental or objective. But most thinkers strongly argue that values must be found in this world. And as we'll see, John Mackie famously argues that there are no objective values. Secondly, Wittgenstein is manifestly incorrect in saying that ethics cannot be put into words. A great number of people, including myself, have said a lot about ethics and value. So perhaps Wittgenstein is claiming that correct values cannot be put into words. But this would open up a debate that Wittgenstein doesn't enter into and loses by default. Yet linguistic philosophy has been accused of trivialization for turning philosophical issues into questions about meaning. For example, what does the word stealing mean, rather than what thoughts and actions does stealing involve? Another example is Brentano's concept of intentionality as a mental process intending towards cognitive objects. But Roderick Chisholm introduces the notion of intentionality with an S as a linguistic feature. That is, intentionality becomes a proposition that something is the case, and that intentionality is supposed to refer to and replace the mental state of intentionality. But Mackie is critical of such linguistic construals of psychological states such as intentionality. He questions how there can be one psychological state of affairs which is adequately described only through a partial description of a differently merely possible state of affairs, that is language. My conclusion at this point is that the linguistic philosophy of Wittgenstein and others systematically neglects, evades, and misunderstands mental states, ethics, and values. Postmodernism, however, is described as anti-value, and that it is a description that postmodernists readily accept. This follows Jean-François Lyotard's definition of postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narratives. That is, meta-narratives like Marxism, religion, Enlightenment values, and even science. The problem for postmodern ethics is rejection of objective moral principles and universal human values. Zygmunt Bauman, for example, speaks of a rejection of the search for absolutes, universals, and foundations. And Adam Phillips states that universal moral principles must be eradicated. These are to be replaced with local and situational responses of individual uniqueness. One problem for postmodernism is that without ethical principles that are values, we can't construct an ethics. There are many criticisms of postmodernism, such as Jürgen Habermas's critique of reflexivity. That is, postmodernists employ analytic and linguistic critiques that only modern reason can provide. But my criticism of postmodernism is their refusal to refer to any normative values at all, and the rejection of structures of consciousness denies them that access to value. The postmodernist Michel Foucault recommends inquiry into both a deepening subjectivity and the notion of care, and he encourages us to ask, how have I constructed myself as a moral agent? And in asking about the care of value, he focuses on three major forces of power, truth, and subjectivity. But this analysis has become political and social rather than focusing on the subjectivity of value that had been left aside. It might be expected that phenomenology is a quintessential study of value, but its contributions are equivocal. Heidegger, for example, talks explicitly about thinking against the values. That is something that needs explaining. With Hume, Sartre writes that phenomenological ontology itself cannot formulate ethical precepts, and his promise at the end of being a nothingness to write a future work on ethics was never fulfilled. And we can say that where phenomenology has been able to explicate value, it hasn't led to the development of a theory of ethics. One illustration of how phenomenology has been able to explicate value has been provided by D.J. Hobbes' recent works on values as a theme in phenomenology. Hobbes presents values as a sui generis phenomena governed by structures, such as intentionality related to the life world and horizons of experience, which influence how objects and situations are perceived. And this counters the relativism of intersubjectivity between people. The similarity between Hobbes' themes and my own emphases on intentionality, structures, and self validation are difficult to overlook. But these themes are not typically general features of phenomenology. Phenomenology has also tended to overlook and neglect value, sharing an epistemological bias with Western philosophy, except that existentialists such as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche seem to be exceptions to this bias. This is because Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, initially wanted it to be a new objective science. That is, Husserl wanted to bracket out our natural understanding of the physical and social sciences in order to obtain a presuppositionless, or we can call value-free, grasp of consciousness. But most phenomenologists like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty thought this wasn't possible, and Husserl himself later gave up this idea in favour of his life world. Yet Heidegger and other phenomenologists have had an ambivalent attitude towards value. Heidegger does cite care as the being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value. So care might be taken as a mode of value, similarly emphasized by Sartre. But Heidegger rejects explanations of care in terms of either value or as an aspect of the will. He repudiates such and rejects any attempts to trace it back to special acts or drives like willing and wishing or urge and addiction. Unquote. This is so because he explicitly talks about thinking against values, and he explains that precisely through the characterization of something as a value, what is so value is robbed of its worth. Unquote. Heidegger goes on to say that this is because every valuing, even where it values positively, is a subjectivizing. It does not let beings be. So Heidegger wants to exclude care and being from a human assessment of values. He becomes more explicit when he writes, "When one proclaims God the altogether highest value, this is a degradation of God's essence." Here, as elsewhere, thinking in values is the greatest blasphemy imaginable against being. Unquote. Such statements that make people think that Heidegger's work is ontotheological. Jean-Paul Sartre describes the ambivalence of value and its obscurity in another way. He writes, its being, that is of value, is to be value, that is not to be being, and that this is what enables us to conceive why value can simultaneously be and not be. Sartre is able to say this because for him, in all cases of lack, value is the lacked. This is consistent with the view that human reality is a lack. But his view of value as the lacked is challenged by the existence of positive value states. These states are such as moral satisfaction, love, magnanimity, and a certain sufficiency of value. Having seen above how value has been neglected in general, as well as by particular schools of philosophy, we are now able to point out specific cases of the neglect of value. We can first note what Rage Jackendorf calls the peculiar logic of value that we'll look at next week. Also next week, we'll examine different kinds of value like material and human values that seem intuitively obvious. But the common conflation of material and human values is a linguistically and culturally contrived confusion. Material values are those of quantification, enumeration, utility, finance, and truth values. Human values are those of wanting and hating, or morals and aesthetics. Thinking that material or human values are the same is a huge confusion of two very different kinds of things. It is like using the same word, like fine, for the two meanings of good and a penalty. I would also like to draw attention to some of the concepts that I have coined myself, such as the idea of value states, a value theory ethics, and the fallacy of the transferability of value. I have discussed these concepts extensively elsewhere, but cite them here to show neglect of value. For example, the terms cognitive states and affect states and volitional states are common in philosophical writing, but it's both anachronistic and highly suggestive that the concept of value states is nowhere to be found except in my own work. The same can be said of value theory ethics, which takes value to be the central principle of ethics. Many other elements have been taken as a central principle of ethics, such as reason, happiness, freedom, responsibility, authenticity, disposition, and virtue. Thomas Metzinger even advocates a theory of ethics based on consciousness. But again, value theory ethics is nowhere to be found except in my own work. Another example of neglect can be found in a misunderstanding of intrinsic value, even by prominent thinkers. Derek Parfit, for example, claims that things like books and rational activity can have intrinsic value. And Ronald Dworkin says that paintings and great trees can have intrinsic value. The idea that value can inhere in physical objects in the absence of conscious observers is an incredible belief, especially for prominent thinkers. I will argue this position in detail in 2 weeks' time. But I'll briefly say here that in my view, only mental states and conscious minds are candidates of intrinsic value. And some kinds of objects are more resistant to having intrinsic value than others. I'll say the most resistant ones first, such as 1. Physical objects, 2. Abstract principles, 3. Human actions, 4. Mental states, and 5. Conscious beings like people. There isn't space to make that argument here, which awaits a future study in 2 weeks. But Mackie strongly argues that there are no objective values, in which he includes intrinsic values. Objectivity here means ontologically substantive entities in the world, not normativity or universality. And Ralph Perry earlier argued that values don't exist until someone values something. The mistake of thinking that values are objective or inhere in the world can be compared to the mistake of thinking that colour inheres in the world rather than being a physiological effect. And in my view, value is something that has to reside in minds or mental states, like wanting or liking. This is because material or abstract objects can't have subjective properties that value must have. This would be disparate kinds of things like numbers and properties of colour. But Mackie gives 3 main arguments in support of his view that there are no objective values. 1. The direction of dependence is mistakenly reversed by making the desire depend upon goodness. 2. His argument from queerness that objective values would have an untenable quasi-objective status. And 3. He points to the psychological propensity of the mind to spread itself on external objects, noted by Freud. Mackie's point that the mind spreads itself and its attributes, like value, onto the world is another explanation of neglect. I have also presented Feuerbach's projection theory of religion as a misapprehension of consciousness. and error theories of consciousness further show how states of consciousness, like value, are overlooked. Hume, Freud, and others have also used the idea of projection to explain misapprehension. Further to his argument from queerness, Mackie writes that if there were objective values, then they would be entities or qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. I agree, because values like wanting and liking can't exist independently of a conscious mind. To explain Mackie's second argument from queerness, it is saying that objective values would be anomalous. This is because objective entities can't have the subjective properties that value must have. These would be disparate kinds of things, like numbers can't have properties of colour. Yet Mackie also makes an epistemological argument against objective and intrinsic values. That is, there is no known means of determining the objective or intrinsic value of objects or actions. We can determine properties like motion and extension of objects or actions, but we don't have a faculty that can apprehend the intrinsic value of objects or actions. Instead, we can only attribute values to things by reason and association. Yet many religious and philosophical thinkers appeal to objective and intrinsic values quite straightforwardly. These include Aristotle, John Stuart Mill, G. E. Moore, Susan Wolfe, Iris Murdoch, John Finnis, Robert Nozick, as well as Derek Parfit and Ronald Dworkin. This is unexpected, considering the arguments against objective and intrinsic values in the world. Does this mean that the arguments against the possibility of the intrinsic value of material objects are flawed? Or does it mean that we have discovered a widespread error in value theory that has gone unnoticed? So I conclude by pointing to both historical and contemporary neglect of the concept of value, not least in ethics. The neglect of value in early religious and Greek thought showed that the idea of value isn't immediately obvious. This neglect was then demonstrated in science, analytic philosophy, linguistic philosophy, and postmodernism, and was even equivocal in phenomenology and was underlined by various errors about value. I've argued here against the intuitive view that we have always had an explicit grasp of the concept of value. This has led to a number of errors about objective value and the intrinsic value of objects. This neglect and other errors lead me to the suspicion that something important has been overlooked. For instance, the possibility of a value theory ethics not accounted for by previous theories of ethics. Yet more than this, my overriding concern is wider than that of ethics. I'm concerned with the role of value in meaning, purpose, and human experiences yet to be discovered. These topics are examined in my other workshops and inquiries. So let me have your criticisms and comments at the meeting or at the meetup or on YouTube internet pages.